Hey guys, welcome to my next tutorial, and this is going to be to show you how to create this neon sort of style, which I've uploaded to the Unity Asset Store, which I'm classing it as the NeonSphere starter pack, and you can see it in the background, and it's just something that I put together which can get you started in creating along with my tutorial series, and can get you started with the neon effects, with the basic materials, using a bit of lighting, reflection probes, and all the cool things that want to get you started. Before I start, I've set up a Patreon recently, and a few people asked me in the past if they ever wanted to support the channel. You can do via there, but by no means do you have to. I'll still carry on the great content from now and the future. So, we're going to create something along these lines with the assets that we've got in here. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with a blank scene. So what I'm using here is a brand new scene in Unity 2019.3, and it's going to take a couple of textures and a few fancy things that we're going to go with it. So when we get started, we want to create a glowing effect, so we want the package that will be able to do that for us, so we need some post-processing. Now in 2019.3, in some different areas it can be get from a different place. You want to go to Window, Package Manager. Now in previous versions you can go to the Unity GitHub and you can download the post-processing for yourself. So when the package manager loads up, you can type in at the top corner, just type in post for post-processing, and it'll be version 2.2.2 in my case, and you just click install. So once that's completed, we will get the post-processing in the packages folder. Now my assets are what we're going to use here. So what we'll start off by doing is right-clicking in the scene and adding a 3D object, and we'll use a quad. And we'll just press F to scale in on that quad, and you can see that it's not exactly where we want it to be in that case of the sort of grid. So we'll hold Control and I will just move this down so it's 90 degrees, as you can see there. So you can see it's 90 degrees, that's perfect. Another thing we want to do is I right click 3D object and add a cube. So you can see my cube is fairly big. What I'm going to do is choose the scale tool, and I'm just going to scale up my plane to say 6 in either of the X, Y, and I'll just move my cube up. I'll hold. So once I've moved that up, we've got the basis of what we want to do. So now we've got this all set up, we're pretty much ready to start with what we're going to do. So our physical player, if we right click and go 3D object, we can select a sphere. So this is going to be our player object essentially, and this is going to be one of the different examples of the things that we've got. So what we can do as a pure example is we can right click in the project panel and start by creating a material. Then the material is going to be our reflective ball as the example. I've got the standard asset. We can keep it as opaque, we can change the color however we choose to do it. But what we want to do is if I just add it to my reflective ball, now you can't see anything. Now if I just change the colour to something like red, you can see it from here, we're going to change the smoothness all the way up so we get a really shiny surface. And we're going to turn the metallic value all the way up. And then essentially we could also enable an emission to make it look like it would glow. You could match up the emission value with the actual object that we've got. We might want to add some little effects to this, so we could add a halo to this object, and we could also make this halo red, but I'll scale the halo down to say a 0.6 roughly, and we'll get a very subtle sort of halo effect around the look of the asset, and we'll make it look more prominent as we go along. I want to actually, while we're here, make sure I enable all the scene effects. You can see that the skybox is not very interesting at all, so we might want to create a basic new skybox really. So we can go create, and we can choose material again, and we can call this neon sky as an example. And what we can do is when we go to the shade type, we can choose skybox, and then we can choose procedural, and from there we can keep this around this value. We can keep it at 0.06. We want maybe the sun size can keep the same. The atmosphere thickness can stay the same, but we might want to tint the sky. So in my other scene, it was a very deep blue kind of tint. So if I readjust that and do the same with the other one, and I'll just make it a very deep blue. Set the exposure just to a solid 1. I'll turn the atmospheric thickness down to about 0.5 so we get rid of the bleeding between the colours here. And then what we can do is we go to our lighting tab, if we go window, and we can choose rendering and lighting settings if we don't already have it. And you can see the default skybox is there. We can just drag our neon sky into the actual skybox there, as we can see. And I know it all looks a little bit crazy at the minute, but trust me, it'll all be fine. And then from there, we've got the very start, we've got our little ball, we've got a bit of a skybox in there, but we might want to create the textures for each of our pieces that we've got. And so you can join me in somewhere like Photoshop or something very similar, and I'm just going to create a new canvas, and I'm going to set this, I'm going to have a texture size of 512 by 512 pixels, and we're going to create this basic sort of that squared checkered pattern that we had. So really what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab the rectangle tool because it isn't particularly fancy what I'm going to do. So I'm going to scale this out and literally put it maybe roughly, this is not an exact art for this example. It can be as wide or as different as you want it to be. Now what I'm going to do is I will make sure that I will just get my rectangle and I'm just going to scale it down so it meets the very edge, the very top and the very bottom, so we've got something like this. Now I'm going to press Ctrl J and just duplicate it to the other side. I'm going to make sure it fits. Do that again, Ctrl J, and then I will rotate it with Ctrl T, hold Shift, and I'm just going to move this into position up at the top because we're exactly the same in each of the actual corner, in each of the sides that we've got. I'm going to do it until we've covered up each of the edges that we've got. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go on the layer styles and add a color overlay and make this just literally a little bit off-white, just for the sake of this. And what I'll do is I'll copy all my layer styles and just paste them into my layers that I've already got, just for the sake of this. I think what else I'm going to do is actually create another box, which is going to be the box that goes underneath our current object. So I'll just make it bigger than the canvas because it doesn't matter as much. Make sure it's the bottom layer. I'm just going to add another blending options color overlay and I'll make this a slightly, I'll go towards the blue and I'm just going to make it more of a darker bluey grey in that sort of style. If you just grab your ruler segments in Photoshop and it will snap to the middle for you if you just be gentle with it. And you can get roughly the middle of your screen. And then we're just going to literally drag our other objects which we've duplicated, our other segments, and just turn them around and make sure we fit it nicely in the middle. So now we've created a sort of, let's say, a crosshair type of thing. So we've got our crosshair made, so we've got our basic texture. It's all pretty much even. We can save this out. So we can save this in our assets folder of our Unity example. And I'll just call this grey a tileable texture. And I'm just going to save it out as a PNG. And then we also want to be able to create something, so we create the emission texture. So emission is when we highlight specific parts of the objects that want to emit light from them. So without a specific black and white image, we can't do the emission very easily without it just emitting from the entire object. But with an emission, I'll show you what I mean. But what we can do is we can go on our blending options, literally go to color overlay again. For our main background, we'll just set that to pure, the most black we can go. We will select our other shapes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to literally right click all those and click merge shapes. Then I'm going to go on the blending options for that by just clicking on the layer, go to color overlay and make sure that they're completely white. So the thing is, as you can see here, is that the white is going to be emissive and the black is going to be completely, it's going to have not taken into account in the emission map. So we can then save this out. I'll call it grey underscore tileable underscore texture and I'll call this illumination, just for short. And you can see I've got my two textures there. What we'll do is we'll do like we did before, create a new material and call this, we'll just call this tileable cube. And from there, we're just going to, into the albedo slot, we'll just add the normal tileable texture. We'll add it to the cube that we've got. You can see it there, already coming together. And then we can add the emission. So we need to tick the emission, and we can actually add a color texture to this emission. So we can just add color, and you can see that only in this one has the emission been taken exactly from the map. So you can see that now the white areas have completely illuminated and nothing else has. So we can create that sort of basic effect. And I will create a new material by right clicking on the project panel, click material, and call this tileable floor. Do the same again. Enable the emission. Add our texture. And if we add it to the tileable floor, you can see that compared to the box with UV mapping on it, it's extremely large. So we might want to scale the tiling of the X and Y. So I could put something like 12 and 12, something like that. So it fits in with the sort of theme we're going for. And you could even literally, by selecting the emission color, you can really turn that down so it's maybe not the same color as our overall box. And we'll just scale that out. Now what we could realistically do is we could grab this quad we've got. We can give it a better name. I can just press Ctrl D to duplicate, and you can see now I've got a duplication. If I hold V, I can select the vertex and I can just snap it to the other ones we've got. So I can duplicate a few and just snap them around. So just like so, we can snap these together really nice and easy just by duplicating with Ctrl D and then holding V and then moving to snap to different objects. We can even select 3, Ctrl D to duplicate. We could potentially pull those out, just grab one of the corners and snap it like so. And we've built our scene a lot quicker. Now we might want to hide these up into, we can create an empty game object. At the top we can go right click and reset. Once we've got our empty game object, we could call this just floor. Like I say, if we're going to try and keep it somewhat organized, we can select all the quads, put these inside the floor, and again, all those quads, put them inside the floor version, and we can just close that up, and we're keeping it fairly organized. And then we might want some walls, so essentially we can do the same thing. We can select a quad. I'll rename this to wall. I'll drag this out of the current folder, and we've got the wall by itself, and what we can do is rotate this around 90 degrees, so you can see that it's 180 on the X, as I do, and then we'll go to the move tool, hold V on our object, and we can just literally snap around as we did before. So we could create another empty game object, right click on the transform, click reset, and then I will just call this walls. I'll put them inside that folder, just so we keep it nice and neat. And again, do exactly what I did before. Snap it all together really nicely. And I'll grab 3 of them together, duplicate our objects. We'll grab the rotate tool, hold control, and when you try and rotate 3 objects, you might want to change the pivot point so it's not in the center, it's for all the objects together. So when you hold it, adjust it to almost 90 degrees. It's just off slightly because it sometimes doesn't do it 100%. We'll go to the move tool again, select the corner and do it like so. We'll duplicate these again, pull them over, grab the rotate tool, rotate them all the way around so it's 270 degrees. Go to our move tool and hold V again, snap, and one last time. I'll just skip this on so you don't have to see. And then from there, if we close it up, you can see now we've got our little sort of test arena, let's say. You could realistically duplicate the floor with Ctrl D on the material and create a different one for all your walls, let's say. And we keep the walls the same, but we could select all of our walls here by opening that folder, pressing on the first one, holding shift and pressing on the one at the bottom, and adding tileable walls to that. We can select back on our walls material, and we might want to leave it like that. We could go back on the floor and maybe make this emission even darker, and we'll set the albedo to even darker than slightly white, so you can see that we've got a slightly differentiated area. And again, we could just adjust it however you want. So you might want these a little bit more prominent or a little bit more towards a light blue. And we've come a long way with what we're doing. You could even essentially scale your ball down slightly if you didn't want it so big in comparison to your other cubes. If not, you could potentially scale up your cube even more, depending if you want to match it completely with the floor. We can make it so big, and just like before, we can press Ctrl D on any of these objects, duplicate them, snap these together in a row and grab another one. We can move that up, grab the vertex, snap it like so. We've started creating a bunch of objects, hold Control, and just, we can push those back, push those into the corner. And from here, we might want to create more of that neon glowy effect. So from here, we can select our main camera and we can go Add Component, and we want to add a post-process layer from the post-processing stack version 2 that we have. And we can keep it on that for now, and then we want to add another one, which is a post-process volume, and then we can set it as global. The weight's at 1, that's fine to get started. We can right click in our scene, we can right click in our project, click Create, and choose Post-Processing Profile. So this is going to be our neon post-processing profile. So we'll press enter on that, and we can add a bunch of effects. So from the effects, we can go to Unity, we can add ambient occlusion, we can add auto exposure, bloom's going to be our favourite one in this, we can add a bit of colour grading, we can add anything else you might want vignette. So from there, what we can do is we can then go back to our main camera, and on our post-processing volume at the bottom here, we want to just drag our neon post-process here. And so what we need to do on the main camera is either create our own layer, or we can just set it to everything for now. If you want to create your own layer, you can add a new layer up here. We can just keep the layer mode as everything for now while we test what's going on. We can select the NeonSphere and we can enable the ambient occlusion, put it on the scalable, and we can adjust the intensity, and you can see it affect the corners here. We can adjust the radius, do some crazy things, but we only want it to be fairly subtle with what we've got here, let's say. Then what we can do is we can add auto exposure, and we can tick all the auto exposure options. And for these main auto exposures, I just like to pull the top anchor down a little bit and then the bottom anchor up slightly. I'll do the minimum to up to about a minus 0.23 and keep the top one just at 0. Leave the contrast and everything as it is. So you can see with the auto exposure we just get a little bit brighter overall in our scene. With the bloom we can enable most of it. I've just enabled the intensity on mine because I was just adjusting the settings previously, and it can get pretty crazy, so we can just tick a lot of the options because you can play around with all these things that you want. We might set the intensity to about 8 because it gets pretty wild. If we keep the threshold about 1, and what we can do is we can create this bloom and make it a very subtle light blue. Then we can go to the color grading. We can set the mode to the high definition range, and we can set the tone mapping to aces, which will completely neutralize a lot of the craziness that's going on in our scene because it just neutralizes a lot of the color. We could increase the temperature to maybe by 1. We could up the saturation that we've got here and change that to a value of something like 2. You can see as I'm going along I can saturate or desaturate the whole thing and keep everything its default shape, its default values, and we can add a vignette to our scene. So we can keep it as classic, put it as dark, and we can increase the intensity of the vignette just to sort of blend our edges slightly. So we've started to get much more of a specific style that we were looking for. And then if we to add a couple more just specific effects to this, we can right click in our hierarchy, click light and choose reflection probe, And I like to add a reflection probe because it gives more accurate reflections for the entire scene. So you want to put your reflection probe roughly in the middle of your scene. Roughly, when I say roughly, just vaguely. And you want to select edit the bounding volume, and you just want to make it encapsulate the entirety of your scene, just so it's just about over the edges of everything that you've got. So you can use these little nodes at either side just to push it out. And you might have to just move around a few times just to get it in the areas that you want. And you can have it above and slightly below, like so. And we can untick it so we get rid of the bounding areas now. So our reflection probe's normally on baked, and it will only change realistically when it's baked. Now, if I selected on this material on the floor and just made sure that it was, because it was all the way at nothing, if I make sure that it's completely smooth, so therefore it's a reflective surface, and I go back on my reflection probe, nothing's updated, but if I put it on real time, you can see that it tries to then more accurately reflect the environment around. Like in the little ball now, we can see the reflection of the environment because it's updating on awake. And we can leave it as, we can put as a box projection, because technically we've got a boxy room, so it makes it more accurate inside. We can leave the resolutions quite low, and we can leave everything as it is, like this. You know, we're not a million miles away from the things that the way that, you know, I've had it before. We can select more of these different shapes and just add them into different areas of our scene, just to sort of build up more of a play area for the player if we were going to be able to let people play. So I'll just quickly do this off camera, because you can see what I'm doing. I'm just duplicating the objects and moving them around. And so what we could even do is we could duplicate this object and go to the scale tool and just make a little mini box as something to differentiate what we've got in our scene. So we've got lots of little, you know, we could have loads of little different things. Or even in the case of our tileable cube, we could duplicate that and call it, like in my other scene, we could call this tileable cube, and we could call this purple. And then what I could do is we could just select a sort of purplish colour, drag it onto our object, and we can select the emission and match it up roughly, and we've got more of an emissive purple cube that we might have been looking for previously. Now, if you really want to go one step further and start doing some simple light baking to bake in the global illumination and things like that, we want to make sure that a lot of these things in our scene are static. So therefore, all our floors, they're never going to move, so we can set them as static. And yes, I'll select the entire folder and just change the children. For the walls, yes, all the walls are going to be static too, because they're never going to move. I'm going to select all our cubes that we've got, because these are realistically never going to move either, so these can be statically baked into our map. And we can click static in the top corner, and it's going to change all those. We could have obviously put those into a corner. Our little cube down here, our little down here is going to potentially in our game move around. So therefore, we don't want to adjust him. We want to just leave it there, and it can just live as it does. What I want to do is I want to make sure that as it's doing now, it's auto-generating. I don't want it to auto-generate at the minute, because if I do a light mapping bake, when all these emission values are on, it's going to blow out the lighting, because we've got so many emissive objects, it's going to go crazy. So what I usually like to do when I do the baking is, let's say I select the tileable cube, the tileable cube purple, the wall and the floor, is that we can go back into the inspector, and because they're all roughly got the same materials on, you can just untick the emission on everything, and so it goes back to a more of a default looking scene. Now we can adjust the direction of the light to however we want. We might want it to be like this, let's say, so the sun's coming in from behind us. We can go to the lighting, and I'll run through some quick lighting. We can leave the intensity and things as they are. We can leave the modifiers. We can do the baked global illumination. We can choose to do baked indirect for more of a... I'll use the progressive GPU for the preview because it's much quicker. I will leave the sample and the environment rate. I can leave the bounties at 2 because it's going to be more accurate with that. I'm going to set the light map resolution to 20 because then it's just going to be easier for us to bake. I'll bake the ambient occlusion just for the sake of this, and it's on a preset of medium, so I'll just set it to a low preset. And what I might do on my directional light before we get started is I'll just set this to an indirect multiplier of 3, so then it gives more indirect light around our scene. So then we'll click generate lighting, and it'll start generating the lighting for us. And then what we can choose to do once it's done a basic sort of light bake here, we can take all the 4 objects that we had that were the materials that we took the emission off and apply those again to add the effects that we've got. We might not want this floor to be shiny more, so we could just take the smoothness all the way back down. So we've started to get a look of where my scene was before, and we get the cool sort of bright areas, the sort of neon glow. We can obviously go in and adjust anything that you want, so you could, go crazy and start, changing intensities or thresholds of the things that are there, so you really make a crazy shiny surface, and then just literally play around with it as much as you want. I've got this scene with all the textures and all the things to get you started on the asset store, and I'll leave a link in the description for you to check all that out. But hopefully this helped you out and you learned a little bit about things that you might not have seen in Unity, or just some basic ideas of how you can go and create something with a couple of textures and a couple of things built into Unity just to save you the time and the hassle. So thanks again for watching. Like I said, I have started a Patreon really recently, so if you do want to support the channel, please go ahead and take a look at it. I will be giving away some more free assets and lots of things in the future, which will come soon. But thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Cheers.